Hey everybody, this is Master LJ for cardrunners.com. Today I was going to go over defining edges. I've coached a lot of students over the last few years, and one of the biggest commonalities I find is that players tend to just scratch the surface with things like EV and profit, and they don't dig any deeper. And in fact, it's one of the biggest leaks and one of the biggest hurdles, I should say, of coming up from short stakes to mid stakes and higher is knowing how to figure out what your edge is, what spots are good and what are bad, and just defining one important spot where people tend to mess up a lot is the all-important difference between EV and profit. So today I put together some examples in PowerPoint presentation form that should leave you with a very clear understanding of what EV is, what profit is, what their relation is, and exactly what defines an edge. It's really important to define your edge because it allows you to play very unemotionally. I think from my experiences, what I've found in my own failures, to be quite frank, is that tilt is really, it's a fear. You fear that you might not have had the edge that you thought you did. You fear that you might not be as good of a player as you thought you were. And so if you can find a spot and say for sure, well, yeah, that was a good play, I know it objectively, then you don't tilt. Who cares what the results are? It's kind of akin to being the casino. If your blackjack tables run negative one evening, I don't think you really care so long as you can be 100% sure that nobody was cheating. You just don't care. It's variance. And when you get to that point, you can really play nearly perfect poker. You can play more hands. You're going to tilt less. You're going to know if your play was good. You're going to know how to find out if it wasn't, which is equally important. So all those things together go into the overall topic of defining edges, which I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so the first thing is expected value versus profit. Very different animals. In fact, I have to admit here, my original PowerPoint presentation had some mistypes in it because they are not interchangeable terms, but they're used interchangeably, and even I had some issues in a few spots I had to edit because of that. But they're very different terms, but there is a relation, and we'll describe that relation by the end of this. So what is expected value? It's the net sum of all possible outcomes, each multiplied by their corresponding probabilities. That's kind of a math definition. That's a rigorous definition. So an oversimplified example, let's say we're playing in an aggressive heads-up no-limit match, and you find yourself with jacks, 100 BBs deep. Your opponent 3-bets, or you 3-bet your opponent to 10 BBs, your opponent 4-bets to 25. Now, I want to state clearly, because first of all, one of the important elements of playing poker, especially at the lower levels, is objective data. My students and people I've seen play tend to go straight to the anecdotes, straight to the sick reads, straight to the, well, I think he's doing, well, I feel. No, that is step 12. There's a bunch of steps that you must take before that to refine the objective data first, and then you apply your reads. Okay, so I'm making a big assumption here that we know somebody's range, and I'm doing that just for demonstration. So assuming we know our opponent's exact range of ace king plus, or excuse me, ace king queens plus and 12 combos of bluff, the EV of shoving over his 4-bet, that's 5-bet jamming, is as follows. So villain's range in combos is 16 AK, 6 queens, 6 kings, 6 aces, and 12 bluffs. So that's 46 total, 34 for value, 12 as a bluff. You can see that he's roughly bluffing slightly less than a quarter of the time. So let's look at given the definition of EV, it's the probability times the likelihood, it's our EV times the likelihood that they have that holding for all possible holdings. So if we shove and villain holds AK, of course they're going to call, so what's our equity? Roughly 56% times a 200 BB pot minus 90 BB. Why 90? Because we've already put in 10. We'll get to it later, but one of the first differences right out of the gate of EV and profit is EV does not care how the money got there in the first place. Pot money is absolutely dead money. Okay, so that's why we only have to subtract our 90 BB shove because the rest is money already in the pot. So we have 56% equity, 200 BB pot minus our 90 shove. It's what we're risking, times how often that happens. That's going to happen 16 out of 46 times. Remember, 46 total combos, 16 combos of AK. So we show that that's clearly plus EV to the tune of 7.65 BBs. If somehow our opponent only ever had AK in that spot, nothing else, then we could shove very comfortably and see a profit. Or yeah, I almost did it. It's plus EV. So the next three examples are equal. Villain has overpair, and there's slight differences, but for the sake of keeping this simple, I gave it all 18% equity when he has an overpair versus our jacks. So we have 18% in a 200 BB pot minus our 90 BB shove, and that's going to happen 6 out of 46 times. So it's negative 7.04 BBs EV each time it happens for the three. Then villain holds air, which is going to happen 12 combos. We win the current pot, which is going to be the 35 BBs, our 10 BB 3-bet, his 25 BB 4-bet, and so it's 35, of course, times how frequently that happens. It's going to happen 12 out of 46 times, as we defined earlier, for an EV of plus 9.13 BBs. So to get the total EV of a situation, you just simply add them all. And you can see it's negative EV. Interesting. So negative 4.34 BBs of shoving jacks against this tight range. It's an extremely tight range, extremely tight bluffing frequency as well from our villain. Let's see here. So what are the implications of this? The shove is not plus EV. Clearly, it's negative. We got a negative number, and we did our analysis. One thing I did want to mention about that is that Stove helps us get aggregate ranges, and it does weight hands by combinations. So it's kind of nice in that respect, is that you could do a shortcut where you put your jack's equity versus the range of hands, say ace king and then queens plus, and then also you would just take the profit from when he folds when he's bluffing. So that 9 BBs of EV that we found when he was bluffing remains, but you could do this all in one big shortcut. That's one of the benefits of Stove, is it allows us to do that. So second implication is how often does villain, well, it's a question, how often does villain have to be bluffing for a shove to be plus EV? So let's do that. Let's find out. At what point, how many combos of bluffs does villain have to have in his hand range in order for us to shove jacks profitably? Now, I know I said this was a heads-up example. I think this is almost a better example for 6-max because ranges are tighter. I think for 100 BBs, it's just about never a mistake to shove jacks in a heads-up match, barring some exceptions. Now, that brings me to a point, and I want everybody to take this with a grain of salt, all these calculations and whatnot, because they're only as powerful as the heuristics you can build from them. And by that I mean, all this math, nobody's expecting you to do this while you're playing. So you have to do it beforehand. You have to study. If you don't understand a spot, you have to do this analysis. And then afterwards, you can build simple rules. Well, this guy's 4-betting 10%. Do I think that accurately reflects his range? Let's look at the sample size. It's a sample size of, I don't know, 10. So that's only one time, right? That could be aces. So now let's say you have a better example is somebody 4-bet 2 times out of 4. Then you could be pretty certain that they're above the threshold, and then shoving jacks is just fine. And as I mentioned earlier, if he shows up with aces, we just don't care. We understood that that was in his value range, and we were never expecting to fold it. We weren't trying to bluff him off aces. And it's just that we were expecting to get some folds sometime, which is more than likely, very likely to have been true if somebody had 4-bet us twice out of 4 times previously, making this this third one 3 out of 5, or 60%. So anyway, back to this. What does the current situation look like on your HUD? If villain is bluffing with 12 combos and has the remaining 34 for value. So that's going to equate to ace king plus, or ace king, queens, QQ plus is 2.6% of hands. Okay, so if you add in 12 combos of bluffs, the way you do this in Stove is you just add in a random offsuit hand. Okay, 7 deuce offsuit, whatever. And it's going to add an additional 12 combos of hands. Pocket pairs are 6 combos. Offsuit non-paired hands, 7 deuce. Ace king offsuit, ace jack offsuit, 9-5 offsuit. Those are all 12 each. Suited non-paired hands are 4. Ace king suited, etc. So in order to do this in Stove, you would put his range as something like ace king, queens plus, and then 7 deuce. You get 3.5% of hands. So that's what his 4-bet should look like. When you see somebody with a 3.5% 4-bet range, that could be what it looks like. It could also be the other way, where they have maybe jacks and 10s in there as well, and they're just never bluffing, but they have all that. And I'm pretty confident, I don't have Stove handy here, that jacks would be profitable against 10s through aces or ace king, or at least have enough equity given that there's money already in the pot. So back to our question, at what point is our shove plus EV or at least break even? So value combos, we already said, is 34. And recall the current pot is 35 BBs. That's our 10 BB 3-bet, 25 BB 4-bet. And recall our EV when villain has AK is 7.65, and then it's about -7 for queens, kings, and aces. So our total EV against his value range and value range only is -13.47 BBs, right? So in order to break even, we need his bluff percentage times the 35 BBs already in there to equal 13.47. That is the equilibrium. That is where it equals 0, where our EV is exactly 0. And so you just solve for x, and in that case x equals 38.5%. But what's that in combos? Well, you have to solve the formula x divided by 34 plus x equals 0.385. That's going to give you a ratio of bluffs to non-bluffs. Okay, and you solve for x, and you get 21.28 combos. I'm going to round up, call it 22. So on your HUD, 22 combos of bluff, 34 for value, is a 4.2% 4-bet. I did it kind of the same way as you did it with 7 deuce hand, except for I added another offsuit non-paired hand and then took away 2 combos to get 22 total. That shows you that his 4-bet should show on his HUD as 4.2%. So as I said, this is probably way more applicable to 6 max tournaments or full ring. Heads up, I think jacks for 100 BBs is rarely going to be bad. But the important question of what does it all mean? And perhaps I should have done it first, but I just wanted to give you the breakdown and the example. You can always utilize the rewind feature as well and rewatch this to, once you understand these definitions, to go back. But we have to look at what exactly EV is. I think a lot of people really fail at knowing what EV is. And it seems like such a simplified thing. Everybody has an intuitive answer. Everybody kind of knows, but nobody knows the definition as it applies to poker. So there's 3 different cases. Your EV is negative. Sorry, I've been fighting cold. Your EV is positive, or your EV is 0. Those are the 3 distinct cases. There are no other cases. Okay? Negative EV, when you have negative EV, is saying that a fold will yield a greater return than the alternate choice. Now, the alternate choice could take on many different forms. It could be a shove, a semi-bluff shove. It could be a call. It could be, I don't know. It's just, basically there's 2 categories, giving up and not giving up. Right? Giving up is usually in the form of a check fold, or check back. And not giving up usually involves a call, a shove, what have you. So positive EV, when you have positive EV, it's saying that a call or shove or whatever, the not give up section, will yield a greater return than a fold. So notice this isn't saying anything about profit. This is just saying what's better than giving up. And of course, neutral EV, this is the important. When you have 0 EV, it's saying that a call or shove is equal, exactly equal to a fold or give up. Okay, so if that's the case, then the only advantage is going to be metagame or informational. So you should always take the choice that either sets you up to have an image that will pay you off later, or to gain information about your opponent. If all things were equal, which they aren't in practice, then 0 EV folding is the same as shoving or whatever. And so it makes no difference. The only thing you're doing by putting more money in the pot is increasing your variance. And that's, generally speaking, it's pretty much bullshit to say, oh, I folded, this is slightly plus EV because I didn't want the variance. You should always take an edge. But if it's truly 0, then you just have to go from metagame and information. If it's close, that's a different story altogether. So if in your model a call is 0 EV, you should always call, right? So we already discussed that. Now, also, it's important that if your model is wrong, so if you call a bet and it happens that your opponent had a hand that you didn't expect them to have for value, that changes everything. You were wrong. You need to reevaluate. And I think that's where most math-based players, especially with heads up, tend to just fall apart. Because, for one, I think ranges are a much better tool for 6-max or full ring than they are for heads up. I know I've said it in previous videos, but I do still think that ranges are not important. I still think I've sort of changed that opinion. They are very important in heads up, but they're much, much more difficult to estimate. And that's what table time gives you, is that you'll know that regs are floating with king jack on ace queen 3 flops and 3-bet pots almost always. Those are kind of anecdotes. That's the anecdote that applies to the model after you've evaluated your objective information. Those types of things. So ranges are important, but they're also difficult. You'll never know how 7 deuce offsuit. Maybe a reg is really feeling like he wants to own you and he wants to barrel 3 with 7 deuce offsuit, show you the bluff to make you feel dumb. You just don't know how that applies, right? So you want to set up your model that is the most friendly to being wrong, meaning it can be wrong by a decent margin and still yield correct results in terms of your EV findings. So let's talk about profit. I always say plus EV don't buy me bling, because it's true. Plus EV isn't saying plus profit. They're very separate animals. So EV analysis also often disregards strategy, at least in practice. Now, the correct form is to do EV strategy from start to finish, from the moment you put in a penny to the tough decision. But most players only use it for difficult decisions, semi-bluffs, should I call it off with open-ended straight flush draw. But they disregard previous streets. So in practice, EV really doesn't tell you much about strategy. Okay, so profit, in the poker definition that I work on, is the real money exchanged between stacks as a result of a given play. This is stuff you can take out and buy or rub on your titties. I don't care. Profit is what we play for. We don't play for plus EV. Now, I actually use an example with my students, right? And it's sort of incomplete, but if you have a cat and he jumps on your keyboard, and he types in, you're playing 100 BBs, he types in a 99 BB raise, enter somehow magically, right? And your opponent shoves. Well, you have to call $1, or 1 BB rather, and it's a 199 BB pot. Of course it's plus EV to call. That would always be plus EV. But you're going to lose money, clearly. So I'm going to give you some better examples of that, and it'll demonstrate exactly what EV is and exactly what profit is and why it's okay to go for plus EV even when it's negative profit. Okay, so we all know that. Profit does not equal EV and vice versa. So let's take a real simple example. You get to the river with a busted flush draw, and you're the first act. So the current pot is 100, and you decide to bluff for pot. We know from my previous video series that to calculate the EV of the bluff, it's the amount risk divided by the amount risk plus current pot, or 100 divided by 100 plus 100, 50% to break even. So just so it's clear, because we have all hundreds there, it's probably not the best example. So if you bet 75, it would be 75 divided by 75 plus 100, 75 divided by 175, whatever that is. But it's going to be slightly less than 50%, of course, probably about 45-ish to break even. So that's saying that if he calls exactly half the time, then you're breaking even. And from our previous definition, it means that there's no difference between checking giving up and bluffing if he calls exactly 50% of the time. Let's assume he doesn't. Okay, let's say we've done a model and found that he can only call with 33% of his hands. Thus, it's clearly a plus EV bluff, but is it profitable? That's the big question, and this is what confuses a lot of people. So let's look at it. EV when villain folds. We're winning the $100 pot 67% of the time. So we're making $67 EV. EV when villain calls, negative 100, because that's what we're risking. The pot is dead money. So this 100, this is probably why I should have used a different example, but this 100 is the amount we bet, and the previous amount, when villain folds, that 100 is the current pot, right? And when villain calls, the negative 100 is our bet. So in the example I gave of the $75, the EV when villain folds would still be 100 because that's the current pot, but EV when villain calls would be negative 75 times 33%. But anyway, in this case, hopefully it's clear. But our total EV is the sum of these two discrete events. You can calling, or you can call it folding and not folding, because you can get shoved on as well. But let's say the combination between our opponent calling us and winning and shoving is 33%. So there's actually 3 different events here, but I've only done 2 for simplicity's sake. But you sum those 2 events, that's the definition of EV, is the probability, is the amount you get from each discrete situation times its probability, okay? And you sum them together, and we have a plus $34 EV bluff here. But is that profit? Well, let's look at it. So in the same situation, let's look at the profit analysis. This means real money exchanged. What is our stack going to end up looking like in each of these cases? Let's assume a $200 stack for discussion. It doesn't matter. Okay, so our pre-bluff stack is 150, because if there's a $100 pot, we assume we put in 50, they put in 50, right? So 200 minus 50, 150. So our stack after a successful bluff is 150 plus 100, 250, $50 in profit. Our stack after an unsuccessful bluff is only $50 because we bluffed for 100 and we had 150. So that doesn't add up. This is not profitable, and you'll see that it's not. Okay, so if we apply the frequencies, 67% of the time we end up with 250 for an average of 167.50. 33% of the time we end up with $50 or $16.50. The weighted average is the sum of the two. In this case, we end up with $184. That's less than we started off with. This is a losing play. But so why are we doing it? WTF. So what are the implications? Our bluff did not yield a positive profit, just a lesser negative profit. And that's huge. So note that our bluff said absolutely nothing about how we got to the river, which is what I said was one of the downfalls of how most players use EV analysis. So how do we make our bluff profitable? Not plus EV, but profitable. Well, the formula is different. It's the amount risked plus our contribution divided by villain's contribution. It's the same thing. We're risking. It's a different way of looking at it, and I would go out and say that it's not as good. I'm jumping to conclusions here, but EV analysis is just fine, and it's all you'll ever need, assuming you know what it means. So, but just for discussion's sake, I just want to show people what it means to look at profit, right? So we already put $50 in the pot. So we're risking our extra 100 plus what we already contributed to win villain's $50. So it's 3-1. So we need a 25% fail rate or less, meaning villain can only call 25% or less in order to show a profit. So in order to show that this is true, we're assuming that villain folds exactly 75%. We do the same analysis. Our stack after successful bluff, 250. Our stack after unsuccessful bluff, 50. It's the same. But now let's look at it in terms of the folding, and we see that we end up with exactly a break-even stack if villain folds 75% of the time. Exactly break-even with the weighted average. So why lesser negative profit is a good thing. Now, I feel douchey saying this, but this is something I've been teaching my students for a long time until finally one of my students said, oh, that's a term, Tommy Angelo has a term for it. It's called reciprocality. So I have to give all credit due to Tommy Angelo for coining the term. It is, I feel such a douche, but it has been something I've been teaching my students for a long time. It's a great concept, and basically it says your exact edge is how much better you play an exact situation than your opponent, right? So if you have Queen 10 and he has Queen 10, how much better are you playing it? You have 7-deuce offsuit, he has 7-deuce offsuit, and in the analogous situation, the same flop texture, the exact same board. And it's sort of a work of fiction, right? Because there's billions and trillions of different combinations. You can lump a lot of them together, but the exact theory here is that they have to be playing with your exact cards facing the only question mark is your opponent's holdings. That's what reciprocality is. So a simple example, and this is just all contrived, is you hold quad aces on an ace deuce jack board. If you're able to extract 70 BBs of profit, 10 hands later, the roles are completely reversed. You have whatever, I don't know, deuces or something on this board, and your opponent is only able to get 50 BBs of profit. Your edge in this spot, your true edge, is 20 BBs plus 20. You played this exact spot 20 BBs better than your opponent. So as you can see, playing aces is easy. Playing top set is easy. Playing a set is easy. But are you playing it that much better than the next guy? And I think this is an area why profits in, say, 6-max and win rates have just declined over the years. People are very aware of these spots. You really have to think, I hate this term, but you have to think outside of the box, and you have to be creative. I think there was a few standout players that just do what looks like weird stuff. Now, you don't want to do weird stuff for the sake of doing weird stuff. You want to have a purpose, have a model that supports why it's profitable, and try it out. You can always go down in stakes and try out new theories. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, a relevant example is our bluff hand that we were discussing. Let's say your opponent folded 67%. While you did not show a profit as we showed, you ended up with, I believe it was $184, and you started with a $200 stack on average. It is a true edge if your opponent is incapable of bluffing in the same spot. So if your average stack was 184, but he doesn't bluff there, he just check folds in the exact same spot, his average stack is 150. So your edge is a real American dollars plus $34 in that spot. These sound like huge numbers I'm talking about. In a $200 pot, your edge is plus $34. Well, yes. The reality is that even fish are going to outplay you in spots. There's no person alive that just trumps every person in every possible billion spots. Fish do weird things which gets them paid sometimes. They may make a thin shove that you wouldn't expect from a reg with top pair deuce kicker on a super draw heavy board, and so you decide to call them down with second pair top kicker. That's a fish owning you. That's a fish playing that spot better than you would have played it against him. That's a true edge for him. So it's the aggregate sum of all of these spots, and you're never going to play it 100% better than the next guy. It would be an interesting thought experiment to figure out how many spots could you play better than a really bad fish. Would it be 70%? Would it be 55%? Would it be even up to 90%? I think just doing a thought experiment right here, right now, it could be anything, really. It could be 51%, but I don't know. So now you should clearly know what an edge is, what it looks like, and how to calculate it. So let's put it into practice. And of course, I favor a heads up. So I'm sorry, 6-max and full ring guys, but it's pretty clear to see how these edges work. And now, I don't play Omaha. I really am probably going to start learning soon. But you see how you can apply the same, at least the thought process, the mechanics, to the same game to find out an edge. It's probably a lot harder in PLO, I'd imagine, but the mechanics are the same. So you have a small pocket pair, this was to do an analysis on small pocket pairs in position 100 BBs deep. That's the situation. That happens a lot, and we kind of know intuitively you can't really call with small pocket pairs for 100 BBs. It's not entirely accurate, but I would say it applies to 90% of people. If you do call with a hand like twos, you do have to be willing to do more than just flop sets and take money in almost all cases for 100 BBs. So let's make some assumptions here. We have to create a model, right? So our opponent 3-bets to 10 BBs and has an overall 3-bet of 25%. Now right off the bat, you can see these are assumptions. These are the weaknesses in our objective data. And these are very prone to error. Well, clearly the 10 BB part is less relevant. But an overall 3-bet of 25%, that's going to be on the high side, and even if you see that on your HUD, that's not necessarily indicative of what the person actually 3-bets. So take all those with a grain of salt and find out sort of what the baseline lowest value, let's say in this case, of 3-betting would make play X okay. That's the way I like to think about things. So what are our options? We can option 1 is fold. The profit is simple. You put 3 BBs in the pot, you're not going out to get it, you lost 3 BBs. Our EV, our pot odds, it's a 13 BB pot, and we have to call 7 BBs. So we're getting 13 to 7, or 13 to, our actual odds are 13 to 7, or if you want it in X to 1 format, as they call it, 13 divided by 7 to 1, 1.86 to 1, 34.97%. So I just quickly stove the top 25% of hands. I didn't make it suited connectors or anything. I don't think it's really going to matter with deuces. It's probably going to vary maybe by 1% or 2. But 45%, we clearly have the pot odds to call, except for we said this is option 1 we're folding. Remember, the EV of folding is always 0. It has to be by definition. Remember the definition. What is better, giving up or not giving up? If folding is the definition of giving up, then it must be defined as our 0 point, from which everything else is judged. So remember, if you can make a profit somehow of -2 BBs in this spot instead of -3, that's by definition plus EV. You would do the plus EV calcs, and it would come out to be plus EV, because it's better than folding by 1 BB, and that's a pretty big edge. Calling. Profit? Question mark. I really don't know. I mean, you flop a set, what, 12% or whatever it is. Your implied odds for the standard 3-bets, you need to make, I think it's about 33 BBs every time, 33 BBs every time. And then on top of that, your opponent is going to have 20% equity against you when you do flop your set. Then there's a whole bunch of playability issues. I don't really know. It's an involved calculation that includes a lot of assumptions. And then if you just think about it, there's a ton of variance in it. How often are you going to flop a set? So it's almost like, I gave this analogy to my student earlier this morning. It's almost like playing tournaments. Your profits are top heavy. Your profits come from beating, 99.99% of the field. They don't come from this intermediate area. You're not going to realize your profits very often. Over a huge sample, you're going to flop like maybe 100 sets. Then there's going to be a huge variance in how much you extracted from each opponent. But all it's saying is that our implied odds are saying that we need to make 30 BBs or more on the average. And that's a pretty tough thing to do. That's 30 BBs on average every time we flop a set. Now, if you're willing to gamble a little, if you're willing to call down super light, bluff, or whatever, assuming you can do that profitably, you can start making looser calls. So now calling our pot odds 13 to 7, which is we need 34.97. We'll just say 35% equity. We have 45%. Clearly it's plus EV, but what we just talked about is playability. I mean, are you really just going to close your eyes and click call, call, call? I mean, clearly, I guess that's a somewhat viable strategy for twos against a really aggressive opponent, is to just close your eyes. But in a snapshot, if you took a snapshot of just that pre-flop decision, you have the equity to call. It's just that you're going to end up folding way more often than you're able to call down light. So same situation, we have option 3 is shoving. Now, I omitted an option which is like 4-betting small. It's kind of like calling. There's a bajillion assumptions that have to be made. I don't even know. What are you doing if you 4-bet small? Are you going to call? Are you going to fold? What are you doing? So you can do that on your own. I've set up the framework. It should be really simple for you guys to just plug these numbers into there. Of course, state your assumptions clearly, but I just said shoving because let's face it, it's no secret. People have been doing this for a while against heavy 3-betters, and it's gotten to the point where I've been called by 8-9 suited, which demonstrates that they might have known what I was doing. I was also called by ace deuce suited, which clearly demonstrates that they did not know what I was doing, since it's an optimal strategy for small pocket pairs. You get called a lot when you do this. You get called a ton. Good regs know that you're doing it. But that sounds like an opening to me for other things. Use your imagination. I've given you guys all the framework. It's very clear. See what you can do to somebody who knows this strategy. You can mess with them a lot. Okay, so shoving, risking 100 BB. This is profit, not EV, profit. We're risking 100 BBs, our total investment, to win 10 of his. So I assumed he has an 8.3% calling range. I called it ace-10 suited, sixes plus, king-queen suited, ace-jack offsuit plus. And against that, you clearly see we have 35% equity. So our profit when called is negative 30 BBs. By the simple calculation, 200 BBs times our equity minus our investment, which was the full 100 BBs only when you're talking profit. If we talk EV, it's 97. But in this case, it's 100. Profit when not called is not the 13 because we're only talking about his money, not ours. We're only gaining an additional 10. And how often is villain calling? Well, clearly if he's got an 8.3% calling range and is 3-betting 25%, it's pretty well defined at 33.2%. That's a somewhat accurate depiction. If you assume the 25% is accurate 3-bet percentage, then you know he always has this top part of his range in there. Well, not always, but 99% of the time. Why else would you be 3-betting so much? This is what you want. You want to get action to the top end. So you know it's always in there. And the cool thing about this is you don't care what the composition of the rest of his 3-bet range is, so long as you can assume he has that top 8.3% in there in his entire range. And that's fine. So if we look at this, what's our profit? 33.2% times our negative 30 BBs. So 33.2% of the time we're making negative 30 BBs. And 100% minus 33.2% of the time, this is time he folds, we're making 10 BBs. So it's a simple summation of negative 9.96 plus 6.68. We get negative 3.28 BB. Simple stuff. Now, this is the continuation. Let's do the EV analysis of shoving. Remember, EV is saying, should I shove or should I give up? Which is better? So same thing here. Our equity is the same versus calling range, except for now we're risking 97 BBs to win 13 BBs. In case it should be intuitive, but our EV should be smaller than our profit. It's okay to be negative profit so long as you're positive EV. You don't want negative both. But I'll show you a shortcut at the end of this as to why you could clearly see that when it's negative 3.28 BBs of profit, we know, I'm giving away the answer here, that it's not EV to shove. So our equity when called is 200 BBs times our 35% minus 97 BBs, as we said in the previous example, is negative 27 BBs. Our equity when he folds, we gain 13 BB. I guess it's not correct term, it's our EV, whatever. But you get the point. So 33.2% of the time we're losing 27 BBs of EV, and 100% minus 33.2% the time he folds, we're gaining 13 BBs EV. It's very, 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 very close. Negative 8.964 and plus 8.684. Now you might say, oh, this is a small mistake, so I should shove. It's close. Well, first of all, if you're wrong in your assumption of his 3-bet range, and it's generally going to be tighter than wider from what I've found, then you're going to be off by a lot. And you're like, oh, well, it's a small negative EV edge. I can take it. No, remember, what is EV? It is comparing exactly the question of what's better, giving up or not giving up. So if it's negative, it's saying that giving up is better. So the shortcut, if you noticed from our first option of folding, if our profit is negative 3 BBs and the profit of shoving is negative 3.28 BBs, we can already see that shoving is worse than folding. And that's exactly what EV tells you. And we know exactly by how much. So these are two independent calculations that confirm the same number, that we have negative 0.28 BBs of EV, but we already knew that. So now you can clearly see the relation between profit and EV. So folding yields us a profit of negative 3 BBs. Shoving yields us a profit of negative 3.28 BBs, but has a bunch of assumptions attached to it. So if we're off by anything, it's just going to make it worse for us, unless in the rare cases 3-bet range is even wider, then it might be okay. And we come to the same conclusion that it's a bad play. Barely, but it's a bad play. There could be some justification. Now, metagame can make up for this. The fact that he's seen you shove deuces is going to make him change how he plays. So you could say that I just shoved it so that maybe I'm going to shove tens and get called by fives, etc. And that's a perfectly reasonable thing. But you see, people dwell too much in that sort of realm. I did this, so he's going to do that, blah, blah, blah. Totally ignoring what's right in front of their faces, which is the objective edge, the objective data, and even just the basic definitions of the data. This is the stuff that the other guys know that you don't, and that's why they're doing better. So in summary, reciprocality tells us that we're okay with negative profit so long as it's plus EV. And as I said earlier, in conclusion, I think you could always just use the EV analysis as long as you remember what it stands for. Is it better to give up or to not give up? It's exactly equal at 0. That's why folding is defined at 0. And if it's negative, it means it's worse than giving up. If it's positive, it means it's better than giving up. And we should always be going after anything that's plus EV. So, this is Ryan McCormick, Master LJ for cardrunners.com. Please feel free to post any questions you have on the forums, and I'll get to them as soon as I can. All right, best of luck at the tables.